the 16th of December 1944, the 3rd Army Command Post, established in a commandeered farmhouse along the Ardennes western fringe, was dimly lit, the low glow of kerosene lamps illuminating maps spread across splintered tables. Outside, wind gusted through the skeletal trees, rattling shutters and whipping snow against the window panes. Inside, the scent of damp wool and engine oil clung to the officers' uniforms, mingling with the acrid smoke of half-burned cigarettes. The supplies were already a growing concern. Fuel allocations had been reduced in anticipation of a slower, methodical advance. Vehicle convoys queued in the icy courtyard, engines ticking sporadically as mechanics struggled with frozen lines and brittle hoses. Ammunition was rationed to essential defensive needs, and rationed again to cover only the first phase of the advance. Patton's staff had annotated each reduction in pencil, tallying the cost of every decision that would now be made under duress. By 1830, Patton had convened a skeletal meeting of his senior operations and logistics officers. Reports were fragmented. Lead armored units at the Corps' front had reached only a fraction of the planned staging areas. Slowed by icy roads and civilian traffic, reconnaissance elements indicated sporadic enemy observation posts rather than fully prepared defensive positions. Each update was logged in the central operations binder, underlined and annotated with the time and source. Patton leaned over the table, finger tracing the route from the southern assembly points toward Bastogne, his voice measured but firm. He emphasized the value of speed over approval, noting that the operational clock would not pause for bureaucratic deliberation. The absence of formal directives from higher command created a quiet tension among the staff. Bradley's liaison was present, seated stiffly at the corner of the room, reviewing the logs in silence. His annotations reflected concern. Standard procedure dictated that no corps should advance beyond assigned axes without explicit authorization. The Third Army's orders had emphasized consolidation and fuel conservation. Yet Patton's assessment of the operational environment framed these directives as obstacles rather than guidance. He highlighted areas where momentum could be seized, pointing to weakly held road junctions and noting alternative routes, bypassing reported German positions. The staff, though aware of the potential consequences, deferred to the implicit urgency of action, understanding that hesitation now would cost hours that the encircled garrison at Bastogne could not afford. By 1930, preparatory orders were whispered across the room, verbal directives moving faster than written dispatches. Corps commanders were instructed to reposition lead armor northward, with infantry following to secure supply corridors. The instructions were intentionally ambiguous in written form, allowing deniability should higher command inquire. The logistics officer protested the strain on fuel reserves, highlighting the potential for immobilization before contact. Patton responded with quiet authority. Immobile units were irrelevant to the decision. Momentum was the only measure of success. Each officer absorbed the risk, logging their agreement in personal notebooks and marking pins on maps that had already begun to fade with repeated folding as darkness fell. The first vehicles began their movement, engines creaking in the cold, headlights diffused by the swirling snow. Reports filtered back intermittently, a stalled convoy at 2015 on the southern approach, a reconnaissance platoon that had bypassed an enemy checkpoint without engagement, scattered reports of German artillery harassing minor intersections. Each report was analyzed, annotated, and placed aside, not as a cause for delay but as a constraint. To navigate, staff officers rotated in shifts, sleeping briefly on benches between updates. Radios crackled intermittently, the signal weakened by the storm, leaving operators leaning close with gloved hands, straining to copy each transmission. By 2230, the operational picture was clear but tenuous. Lead elements of the 4th Armored Division had reached a midpoint along the planned axis. Though still short of the outer perimeter of Bastogne, German resistance was lighter than expected. Scattered infantry and hastily emplaced anti-tank guns testing the advance, but failing to slow the columns decisively. Each mile gained further stressed the already limited supply chain. Fuel consumption exceeded planned projections, and the commanding officers made split-second adjustments. One tank company redirected along a bypass route to preserve gasoline. Another ordered a slow movement to allow infantry to close gaps. Every adjustment carried the risk of alerting the enemy to the scale of the maneuver, but delaying the advance would jeopardize the overarching objective. Throughout the night, Third Army staff functioned in a delicate balance between calculated risk and moral pressure. Radio intercepts indicated that German observers had begun to register the northward movement, though reports were contradictory and incomplete. Patton's staff debated whether to tighten security and disguise the axis of advance or continue. Unimpeded, he weighed the risk. Any slowdown would reduce surprise. Yet continued forward motion without full logistical coverage could expose units to immobilization in terrain made treacherous by snow and ice. Patton's decision was absolute. Speed would be maintained, adjustments made only for critical obstacles. No formal authority had been granted, but operational reality had created its own mandate. By 0200, on the 17th of December, the first elements of the northern thrust had passed beyond checkpoints previously considered secure by German command. Enemy reconnaissance had not fully assessed the scale, reporting activity in localized pockets rather than a coordinated advance. The Third Army's movement, still largely undetected in operational scope, began to strain German communication and response. Staff officers in the command post updated maps with colored pins, rotating them slightly to track each regiment's progress, while maintaining logs of fuel usage, vehicle attrition, and projected resupply windows. Each log entry was a tacit acknowledgement of both the gamble and its necessity. The night's operation concluded with measurable results. The 1st Battalion had secured a forward junction 2 miles from Baston's southern perimeter. Fuel and ammunition were now the immediate concern. Any further delay or misallocation could halt the momentum entirely. Patton reviewed the operational summary personally at 0430, circling key positions with pencil, annotating risk factors and alternative routes. The first irreversible order advance, without waiting for formal approval, had been executed. Its consequences would not be fully measurable until daylight revealed both the enemy's reaction and the remaining logistical capacity. By 00, the farmhouse command post was quiet, save for the intermittent crackle of radios and the distant hum of engines on icy roads. Staff officers recorded final logs, noting frostbite cases among vehicle crews, stalled supply trucks, and minor skirmishes along the axis. The tension was not of combat, but of decision, a weight of moving without authority, balancing risk against opportunity, and the moral responsibility each officer now bore. Supplies were dangerously low. Higher command remained uninformed. Yet Patton's movement had begun, deliberate, unapproved, and irreversible. The operational gamble was in motion. Momentum had replaced procedure, urgency had overridden caution, and the Third Army had crossed a threshold from planned maneuver into autonomous initiative. As dawn approached, the first tangible consequence of nightfall's decisions would emerge on the frozen roads of the Ardennes, where every mile gained pressed the enemy to respond before it was too late. The 17th of December 1944 by 0600. The Ardennes morning was pale and gray, snow still falling in fine, icy threads, drifting across roads and empty fields. Third Army headquarters, occupying a shuttered village hall, was already humming with activity. Maps covered every available surface, pinned with color-coded indicators, marking regiment and corps locations. The early reports from the night's northern pivot had arrived. Lead armor had progressed beyond initial phase lines. Roads remained icy but passable, and reconnaissance reported minimal resistance from scattered German positions. Yet the logistics picture was stark. Fuel supplies had been diverted from reserve depots, rations were now strictly measured, and ammunition allocations were tightly constrained to essential movement and defensive coverage. Staff officers rotated in shifts, jotting updates by lamp light, rubbing frost from fingers, their breath visible in the cold air. Patton entered the room quietly at 0620, removing gloves and scanning the assembled commanders. Bradley, present as liaison, observed closely, his expression measured, noting the unorthodox method about to unfold. Normally, communications and movement orders would be carefully vetted, routed through multiple layers of staff, and codified before execution. Patton ignored this process entirely. His focus was the operational clock, not precedent. He spoke directly to the corps and division commanders, outlining his intent for the northward pivot, the axes of advance, and the critical timing windows to maintain momentum. His voice carried authority without theatricality, but the weight of bypassing formal channels was palpable. Bradley noted the risk immediately. The initiative was outside the bounds of typical command procedures, leaving higher headquarters in Brussels and theater headquarters as passive observers rather than participants in the decision. By 0635, preparatory movements began quietly. Armored columns repositioned along cleared routes, engines idling in the snow while drivers adjusted chains and warmed engines. Supply officers, given oral guidance from Patton's staff, began limited fuel stocks to lead units. Each adjustment was logged meticulously in the operations ledger, annotated with timestamps, source references, and projected consequences. The entries reflected both compliance and apprehension. Officers were executing orders they understood to be outside conventional protocol, and every deviation carried both operational and personal risk. Radios buzzed intermittently, carrying encrypted updates, each message copied into logbooks and referenced against unit location pins on the central map. By 0710, the 1st Armored Regiments had begun the initial phase of the northward pivot. Movement was cautious but deliberate. Every mile gained increased operational tension. The staff monitored each convoy, recording delays caused by icy roads, minor enemy probes, and vehicle malfunctions. At 0725, A scout unit reported German reconnaissance, observing movement along a southern road junction. The report was logged, and Patton's response was immediate. Maintain course, exploit surprise, and do not slow for minor contact. Each officer understood the moral and tactical calculus implicit in that instruction. Obedience to procedure had been subordinated to necessity. Bradley's observation post provided a detached perspective on the unfolding initiative. He noted the tension among senior officers. Some hesitated when passing the verbal orders along, others logged the guidance without comment. The ambiguity of authority created a subtle undercurrent of unease. The chain of command had been altered by circumstance, and the risk of formal reprimand lingered in the background. Yet each subordinate officer understood the operational imperative. Delay would compromise the garrison at Bastogne and the entire northern advance. The balance between compliance and initiative was now measured in miles and minutes, not formal approval. By 0830, the northern axis of movement had reached a critical phase. Lead armor had crossed the secondary road junction previously monitored by German eunuchs, establishing a tenuous corridor for supply and follow-on infantry. Supply officers coordinated in real time, adjusting limited fuel allocations to maintain momentum, while staff logged each redirection in precise detail. Communication friction was visible. Radio nets were congested, messages truncated, and some units had received only partial updates. Yet Patton's guidance allowed for flexible interpretation. Initiative and speed took precedence over rigid sequencing. At 0915, a reconnaissance battalion reported increased German observation posts along the western approaches. The information reached staff officers as fragmented radio traffic. Some calls repeated coordinates already logged, others were delayed by static interference. Staff marked the positions on maps, annotated with time and unit reliability, but no order to halt or redirect was given. The principle was clear: speed and initiative outweighed procedural caution, and each commander bore responsibility for judgment calls on the ground. Every decision, however small, carried operational consequences that would compound as the advance continued. By late morning, the operational rhythm of the Third Army had shifted entirely. Command was decentralized in execution, but centralized in intent. Patton set the strategic objective. Corps and division commanders implemented in real time. Movement continued across multiple axes. Supply lines were rerouted, and every mile gained forced German units to respond without clarity or coordination. Staff logs reflected constant recalibration, delays, vehicle attrition, minor engagements. Fuel consumption and weather-induced obstacles were recorded as they occurred, feeding the larger operational narrative. By 1200, the initiative was unmistakably in Patton's hands. The encircled garrison at Bastogne remained isolated but now had the prospect of relief in sight. Each mile gained by Third Army units increased operational tension among both staff and commanders. Compliance to orders was intertwined with the necessity of speed, with every officer aware that procedural missteps could have strategic consequences. Bradley, observing from the side, noted the extraordinary circumstance. Patton had effectively seized command of time itself, moving the army in defiance of standard hierarchy while remaining within the bounds of operational reality. As afternoon approached, the first tangible consequences of the verbal directives became evident. Lead columns advanced past known German checkpoints, their movement detected only in partial fragments by enemy reconnaissance. German command, still assuming a predictable methodical response from the Allies, remained in the early stages of recalibration. Within the Third Army headquarters, each update was recorded with a sense of urgency and precision. Vehicle fuel gauges, ammunition tallies, and estimated times of arrival were annotated continuously. Every movement carried risk, yet the advantage of initiative was undeniable. By 1700, Patton's gamble had taken full operational form. Supply lines were stretched, fuel allocations critically low, but the northward pivot remained unbroken. Staff officers, logging the evening summary, noted frostbite cases, stalled vehicles, and minor skirmishes along the route. Yet the army continued moving. The operational decision, taken without formal authorization, had created a dynamic where higher command could only observe the unfolding events. The initiative rested entirely on judgment, momentum, and the willingness to absorb risk. Nightfall saw Third Army columns spread along multiple routes, the northern pivot firmly underway. Each mile of advance was a testament to deliberate risk, executed under pressure, with supplies low and formal orders intentionally bypassed. Staff officers logged all developments meticulously, balancing compliance with apprehension, aware that the operational consequences of each decision would be realized only as the enemy reacted. The command structure had shifted, if temporarily. Patton controlled the operational tempo, higher headquarters observed, and German forces were confronted with a problem they had not anticipated. The army had crossed the line of command. Initiative, speed, and operational necessity now defined action. with every officer and staff member engaged in a delicate balance of obedience, judgment, and risk management. By midnight, the northward pivot was irreversible. The operational clock had passed beyond the point where conventional procedure could reclaim control. The Third Army had embraced urgency over formal authority, and the consequences measured in both opportunity and exposure would unfold over the coming hours. The 18th of December 1944 by 0100 hours. The German forward command posts along the southern Ardennes began logging anomalous activity. Observers reported vehicle lights glimpsed through snow and intermittent headlights on secondary roads. Initial radio intercepts, fragmented and obscured by static, suggested small elements of Allied armor probing the northern axis, but German staff interpreted these movements as localized reconnaissance rather than a coordinated advance. Reports referenced platoon and company-sized contacts along secondary roads south of Bastogne, with no recognition that multiple columns were advancing in parallel. 0230. The 5th Panzer Army's operations officer received a courier-delivered summary from 47 Panzer Corps. The report listed sporadic enemy vehicle sightings between Martlange and Wiltz and noted minor skirmishes at road junctions. Analysis in the operations room emphasized disruption rather than threat. The language used, isolated movements, fragmentary reconnaissance, reinforced the assumption that Allied units were probing, testing positions, rather than executing a full-scale relief. The commanding general, seated beneath a single lamp, tapped a finger on the map and repeated to his staff, "Pressure localized. No decisive advance observed." The staff nodded, updating logs with confidence, unaware that the description failed to capture the operational reality. By 0330, conflicting orders began to emerge. The northern sector was instructed to fortify defensive positions near key bridges, while southern units were simultaneously directed to reposition westward to cover perceived gaps. Communication chains stretched across frozen roads delayed both the transmission and receipt of these instructions. Corps and divisional commanders recorded the orders in logbooks, often annotating with qualifiers such as pending confirmation or coordinates approximate. Reflecting both the uncertainty of the terrain and the lack of coherent guidance, units adjusted piecemeal rather than in concert, resulting in gaps between formations and reduced mass defensive capability. At 0415, a reconnaissance report indicated a heavier concentration of Allied armor advancing along the southern approach than previously noted. German staff officers marked the positions on maps with red pins, but analysis remained constrained by prior assumptions. The report was relayed to Army headquarters, but no immediate operational adjustment was ordered. The commanding officer, relying on established doctrine, believed that localized probes rarely indicated strategic intent and instructed staff to maintain current posture. This misinterpretation allowed Patton's advance to continue exploiting unmonitored corridors, moving faster than German intelligence could process or respond to. By 0530, weather compounded the operational confusion. Snowfall had reduced visibility to under 300 meters, and intermittent blizzard conditions obscured road networks. German observation posts reported difficulty confirming movement beyond lean forward radio nets, congested with multiple units reporting minor sightings, fragmented into incoherent chatter. Staff officers logged each report but struggled to synthesize them into a coherent operational picture. The effect was cumulative, delayed recognition of scale, conflicting defensive priorities, and an underestimation of Allied coordination. At 0610, a divisional headquarters along the eastern perimeter issued a provisional counter-move, repositioning one Panzer battalion to reinforce a bridgehead near Rochefort. Simultaneously, another Panzer regiment received instructions to prepare blocking positions along the northern approach. The orders were transmitted over separate channels, received at slightly different times. By 0635, the units' paths intersected awkwardly, creating temporary congestion on icy roads and slowing both formations. Field commanders noted the traffic, marking delays in logbooks, but execution continued. The piecemeal adjustment, the potential for a coordinated counter-stroke. By 0715, Patton's lead armored column had reached within 15 miles of Bast. The speed of advance exceeded German expectations. Reconnaissance elements misidentified spearheads as independent reconnaissances, ignoring the cumulative threat of multiple converging columns. Staff officers in German command noted the anomaly, but deferred operational judgment, citing incomplete confirmation. Each delay reinforced the operational advantage of the advancing Allies. At 0810, reports from the southern perimeter indicated that small Allied units had engaged minor defensive positions but bypassed others entirely. German units, already stretched thin and moving in isolated blocks, could not concentrate force effectively. But orders to halt the Allied push or counterattack were slow to reach forward elements. When they did, the messages conflicted with previous instructions, The result was hesitation at the battalion level and incomplete repositioning. Patton's columns, unimpeded by massed resistance, pressed forward. By 0900, the operational rhythm had shifted decisively. German units, intended to hold critical junctions, were misaligned due to staggered movement, icy roads, and poor reconnaissance. The window for coordinated defense, once the central advantage of the Ardennes Plan, was closing. Reports from the northern sectors noted that the Allied push had created gaps between defensive blocks, up to 4 kilometers wide. These vulnerabilities went unexploited at the German staff level due to both procedural caution and delayed recognition of the advance's scale. 0945, hired headquarters attempted to consolidate understanding. Corps and Army-level staff convened in separate command posts, maps spread across tables and lamps, illuminating frost-streaked faces. Analysts cross-referenced, intercepted radio chatter, reconnaissance updates, and prisoner reports. Attempting to piece together the true scale of the northward push, contradictions abounded. Reports suggested small groups, yet scattered engine. Noise and vehicle sightings indicated larger forces. No single picture could be verified conclusively. The commanding general, frustrated, annotated maps with the note, Allied intent unknown, maintained defensive posture. By 10:30 the German approach had become reactive rather than proactive. Units repositioned defensively, filling perceived gaps in isolation, without establishing cohesion or synchronization across corps boundaries. Timing, once a German advantage, now worked against them. Patton's columns continued to advance at a steady clip, taking roads unobserved, crossing secondary junctions, and exploiting the confusion created by contradictory orders. Every mile gained was both a physical and psychological advantage, compounding the uncertainty in enemy command. By midday, German staff recognized the scope of the misjudgment. The northern pivot was larger than anticipated, and the speed of advance threatened critical junctions west of Bastogne. Yet immediate countermeasures were constrained. Frozen roads, ongoing logistical congestion, and dispersed units prevented rapid massing of forces. The initial assumptions underpinning the Ardennes offensive that Allied reactions would be methodical and localized were now exposed as inadequate. Time, once a strategic friend, had become a liability. At 13:15, a fragmented counterorder was issued. Reserve armor was to intercept advancing columns near a secondary route leading to Wildt's execution. Delayed by radio congestion and icy roads, achieved limited effect. Lead Allied units bypassed German positions where possible, leaving minor engagements for follow-in infantry. Patton's gamble, predicated on speed and initiative, continued to pay dividends. By 1500, the operational picture solidified. German command remained capable in isolated engagements, but unable to consolidate force or regain initiative. Report from divisional headquarters indicated that key road junctions had been compromised, forcing a reactive posture. Orders were issued with increased urgency, yet the tempo of Allied advance prevented cohesive implementation. Field commanders marked units and obstacles on maps in red, denoting urgent response. Yet these annotations reflected awareness of risk rather than the ability to change outcomes. By 1700, the cumulative effect of misjudgment and piecemeal defensive action was undeniable. Patton's northward pivot had created multiple gaps in the southern perimeter, disrupted German internal communications, and imposed operational pressure that could not be relieved without a complete reorganization of command and control. Each German unit operated effectively in isolation, yet coordination between formations was absent. The initiative, once firmly German, now rested with Third Army. Nightfall reinforced the disparity. Patton's columns had pressed close to Bastogne, bridging gaps that German command had assumed impossible. Conflicting instructions, delayed execution, and misinterpretation of reports had diluted the enemy's reactionary impact. Time had shifted. The hours that should have allowed German forces to consolidate had instead enabled the Allied advance. Patton's gamble, audacious and unorthodox, continued to exploit the structural and procedural weaknesses inherent in the Ardennes Plan. By 2200, German staff officers logged the day's failures with mounting concern. Reports were consolidated, highlighting the disconnect between perceived and actual threats. Orders for tomorrow's defensive posture were drafted, yet the ability to implement them effectively remained uncertain. The operational rhythm was lost. Initiative, cohesion, and timing, the critical pillars of the offensive, had been eroded, leaving German command reactive, fragmented, and unable to restore control. The 19th of December 1944 at 0100 hours. Third Army headquarters was a dimly lit hive of motion and anticipation. Lamps cast yellowed pools of light over maps stretched across oak tables, worn along creases from repeated folding. Radios emitted a constant hum, interspersed with static and clipped messages, some relayed multiple times due to degraded line quality. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley sat near the center of the operations room, observing the flow of information with quiet intensity. Each incoming message, each scribbled note, conveyed both progress and risk. He had witnessed the initial deviation from formal orders, the northward pivot executed without explicit approval, and now the consequences unfolded in real time. By 0145, reports from lead armored columns indicated continued advancement, despite snowbound roads and intermittent enemy resistance. The 4th Armored Division's forward units had covered over 12 miles since last reporting, navigating secondary roads partially obscured by nightfall and heavy snowfall. Fuel consumption exceeded projected allocations. Reserves fell to roughly one-third of expected stockpiles. Engineers sent status updates on bridges. Several key spans had minor structural cracks, exacerbated by temperature swings, requiring careful traversal. Bradley noted these constraints in his log, underlining them with a pencil. Aware that any delay or breakdown could stall the advance entirely. 0300. Communications staff relayed an updated report from the 12th Corps. German units along the southern approaches were still reorganizing after misjudging the scale of the advance. Fragmented defensive lines, inconsistent counter-orders, and misinterpreted reconnaissance allowed Patton's columns to exploit multiple gaps simultaneously. Bradley observed the map annotations, red pins indicating enemy positions, blue pins for advancing columns, and every mile gained by Third Army units shifted the operational tempo irreversibly. He recognized the audacity of the maneuver. Deliberate, calculated, and inherently risky. By 0415, the operational strain was visible among staff officers. Typists worked in shifts at portable radios, transcribing messages and dispatching couriers. Frost seeped through the wooden floorboards of the temporary headquarters, and hands reddened despite gloves. Officers consulted folded maps with pencils, rotating them repeatedly to trace alternate routes and evaluate contingencies. Bradley remained still, absorbing both the progress and the operational exposure. Each minute of delay or miscommunication could have halted Patton's momentum. Conversely, speed compounded the risk of overextensionics. At 0530, forward reports confirmed that armored elements had reached a critical road junction west of Martlange, encountering light resistance from hastily positioned German infantry and anti-tank teams.